Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
After 15 years of marriage, my husband said, "You are used material," and left for a 19-year-old. I just smirked. He had no idea that I had secretly transferred all the property to my name. What happened the next morning? Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say, They say a wife always knows, deep in her bones, long before she lets herself think it clearly. I used to roll my eyes at that. I used to believe that I was different, rational, observant, too smart to be blindsided. I was wrong, or maybe I was right all along, and I just loved him too much to listen to myself. His name was Daniel Marsh. We met at a 4th of July party in Columbus, Ohio, 22 years ago. He was 31, I was 28, and he had this way of listening to you like you were the only person in the room. That was his gift. That was also, I would later understand, his greatest weapon. We built something real, or so I believed. We bought a house in a quiet suburb of Columbus, a 3-bedroom colonial with a white porch and a maple tree in the backyard that turned brilliant orange every October. We had 2 children, Chloe, now 17, and Marcus, now 14. I worked as a licensed property appraiser for 15 years, building a client list, earning a reputation. Daniel ran a mid-sized HVAC business he'd inherited from his father. On paper, we were the picture of a stable American family. On paper. The first crack appeared about 2 years before everything fell apart. It was small, the kind of thing you file away under probably nothing. Daniel started going to the gym. Not unusual, but he went at odd hours. 6 in the morning on Saturdays. 9 at night on Tuesdays. He bought new clothes. Not the practical flannels and khakis I knew, but fitted shirts in colors he'd never worn before. Slate blue, olive green. He started using a different cologne. I noticed. I said nothing. Then came the phone. He'd always been the kind of man who left his phone face up on the kitchen counter. One evening, I walked into the living room and found him tilting the screen away from me mid-text, the motion so automatic, so practiced, that I understood immediately it wasn't the first time he'd done it. He just smiled and said it was a work group chat. I nodded. I went to the kitchen and stood very still over the sink for a long time. Over the following months, the signals accumulated like water in a basement. Slow, quiet, and deeply damaging. Late client dinners, a weekend equipment conference in Cincinnati. He mentioned offhandedly 3 days before he left. A slight but unmistakable shift in how he looked at me, not with hostility, but with something worse, indifference, as though I had become furniture, functional, unremarkable. I started paying attention to our finances, not out of suspicion, I told myself, out of habit, professional instinct. I was an appraiser. I read numbers for a living, and the numbers were telling me a quiet, ugly story, small cash withdrawals, a restaurant charge in a neighborhood where he had no clients, a hotel booking I found on a credit card statement for a date he claimed he'd been at a trade show. Still, I said nothing. Why? Because I was afraid. Because 15 years of a life shared with someone creates a gravity you don't escape easily. Because I had children. Because part of me still hoped I was wrong. I was not wrong. It happened on a Wednesday evening in March. Chloe was at volleyball practice. Marcus was at a friend's house. I'd come home early from a client appraisal, and the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. I found Daniel in the kitchen, already home, standing near the window with his jacket still on like he'd been caught mid-decision. He turned around, and I saw in his face that whatever conversation was coming, he had already rehearsed it. He told me he wanted a divorce. He told me he had met someone, that she made him feel alive, that our marriage had been empty for years. Then he looked at me. really looked at me, with something I can only describe as contempt dressed up as pity. And he said the words I will never forget as long as I live. "Claire," he said, "you're used goods. Used goods. 15 years, 2 children, a house, a life, 1,000 ordinary mornings with coffee and car keys and the sound of his breathing beside me." And that was his summary. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood very still, the way I had learned to stand over the kitchen sink all those months ago, and I looked at him. And I smiled, not because I was fine. I was not fine, but because in that single moment, something cold and precise clicked into place inside me, and I already knew, before he even finished speaking, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He just didn't know it yet. He left that same night. He didn't pack everything, just a bag, the expensive duffel he'd bought for the Cincinnati trip he thought I'd believed in. He walked out the front door at 9:47 p.m., and I know the exact time because I watched the clock above the stove like it was the only fixed point in a spinning room. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. The maple tree outside the window was still bare. March in Ohio doesn't forgive you with early leaves. Everything looked the same. The dish rack with 2 glasses drying, Marcus's cleats by the back door, a permission slip for Chloe's school trip still held to the refrigerator by a magnet we'd bought in Gatlinburg 4 years ago. Everything the same, everything utterly different. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. The fear was real, and it was physical. A cold, heavy thing that lived in my sternum for the first 48 hours. I was 51 years old. I had a teenage daughter and a 14-year-old son who didn't yet know their father had left. I had a mortgage. I had a career that was solid but not extravagant. And I had a husband who had just called me used goods and walked out to a 19-year-old. Her name, I found this out within a week through a combination of social media and the particular cruelty of small social circles, was Kayla Sims. She worked at the front desk of the gym Daniel had been attending. She was 19 years old. She had a bright Instagram full of gym selfies and iced coffee cups and quotes about manifesting your best life. She did not look cruel. She looked young, painfully, recklessly young. And that, in a way, made it worse. But here is the thing about fear. It has a shelf life, and mine expired on the 3rd morning. I woke up at 5 a.m. on a Friday, the house still dark, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling with a clarity I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. The fear was still there, but underneath it, underneath all of it, was something else. Something I recognized from years of professional work, the calm, methodical readiness that comes before you begin a complicated assessment. I was an appraiser, I evaluated assets, I determined value. I knew exactly what things were worth. And I knew something that Daniel, in his arrogance, had never bothered to consider. I had been managing our household finances for 11 of our 15 years of marriage. Not because he asked me to, because he didn't care to. He signed what I told him to sign. He trusted me with the accounts because it bored him. And in doing so, he had handed me a set of keys he didn't know existed. The properties. That was where I started. We owned 3 pieces of real estate. The family home, the colonial with the maple tree, a rental duplex in a suburb east of Columbus that generated monthly income, and a small commercial property Daniel had acquired 6 years ago, a a strip unit he leased to a dry cleaner and a nail salon. 3 properties, all of them jointly titled. But I was the one who had handled every closing, every renewal, every tax filing. My professional license meant I understood property law in Ohio better than most laypeople, and I knew that in Ohio, with the right legal guidance, with the right documentation, with the right timing, things could be moved, legally, quietly, with paper trails that told a story I chose to tell. I called my attorney on Friday morning at 8 a.m. when her office opened. Her name was Sandra Okoye, a family law specialist I had known professionally for 6 years. I had appraised properties for several of her clients' divorce settlements. She owed me nothing, but she respected me. That mattered. Daniel served me with nothing, I told her. He just walked out. That gives us time, she said. Time. That was the word I needed. Sandra and I met that afternoon in her office downtown. She explained my rights clearly and without sentiment, which is exactly what I needed. Under Ohio law, marital assets acquired during the marriage were subject to equitable distribution. But equitable didn't mean equal. It meant fair, as determined by a court based on contribution, need, and a range of other factors. As the primary financial manager of our household, as the licensed professional who had directly overseen the acquisition and maintenance of 2 of our 3 properties, I had a strong claim. But she told me something else. Something I had already been quietly thinking about for 2 days. If you have the legal authority to restructure any of these holdings and do it before he files, you are not doing anything illegal, she said carefully. You are protecting marital assets. Courts look at what exists at the time of filing. Make sure what exists tells the right story. I drove home along the highway as the sun went down orange over the flat Ohio fields. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mind was the quietest it had been in months. I had a plan. The following 2 weeks were the most focused of my adult life. Sandra and I worked methodically. The rental duplex had been acquired 7 years into our marriage, financed through a combination of my professional income and a loan I had personally guaranteed. Daniel's name was on the title because we were married, and it seemed natural at the time. The way so many things that seemed natural at the time turn out to be careless in retrospect. The commercial property was similar. Daniel had identified it, yes, but I had done the appraisal, arranged the financing, and managed the lease agreements every year since. Sandra filed a motion establishing my protective interest in both properties as the primary financial contributor on record. This wasn't a transfer of ownership. It was a legal designation, documented and defensible. It meant that any unilateral decision Daniel tried to make about those properties would require court approval first. Effectively, they were frozen. He couldn't sell them out from under me. He couldn't mortgage them further. He couldn't use them as leverage. The family home was different. It was jointly titled with a straightforward marital history, and Sandra advised leaving it in its current state. Attempting to move it would look aggressive in court and could backfire. Leave the house, she said. The other 2 are the ones that matter for income. Focus there. I focused there. In the second week, I also did something quieter. I began systematically organizing documentation, every financial record from the past 15 years that I could access, bank statements, tax returns, receipts for home improvements I had contracted and overseen, records of the rental income I had managed, email threads in which Daniel explicitly deferred property decisions to me. This wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of contribution. In a divorce proceeding, contribution is everything. I was building a case. I was building it the way I would build any professional assessment, brick by brick, number by number, document by document. And then, in the third week, Daniel called. He called on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had a new quality in it. Something careful, slightly clipped, the tone of a man who has been advised by someone to pay attention. He asked how I was doing with the performative warmth of someone reading from a script. I told him I was fine. He asked about the kids. I gave him appropriate, civil answers. Then he said, almost too casually, "I'm going to need us to sit down and talk about the properties." I said, "Of course. Have your attorney contact Sandra Okoye." A silence, longer than it should have been. "You have an attorney already," he said. It was not a question. "I do," I said pleasantly. "Good night, Daniel." He found out about Sandra's protective filings within 48 hours. I know this because Chloe, who had been splitting time between both homes with the brave, exhausted adaptability of a 17-year-old who loved both her parents and blamed neither, came home from a visit to Daniel's new apartment with a look I recognized. The look of a child who has overheard something she wasn't meant to. I didn't press her. But later that evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said quietly, "Dad seemed really upset about something with the properties. He was on the phone a lot." "I know, honey," I said. "The lawyers are handling it." She nodded. She didn't ask more. I loved her for that. 3 days later came the moment I had been both preparing for and dreading. The thing I needed to see with my own eyes, not to build my legal case. Sandra had enough for that, but for myself, for my own certainty. A former colleague of mine named Patrice, who did real estate photography and knew half the professional community in Columbus, sent me a message on a Thursday afternoon. Just a link. No explanation. It was a public Instagram post from Kayla Sims's account. A photo of the interior of an apartment. A very specific apartment. One I recognized because I had appraised the building 3 years earlier. A mid-rise in the Short North neighborhood. Newer construction, not cheap. And in the background of the photo, visible in the edge of a dresser mirror, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, was Daniel's blue gym bag. He was living with her. He had moved out of our home and directly into an apartment with a 19-year-old, while apparently expecting that I would wait, passive and grateful, for him to decide how to divide our shared life. I set my phone face down on the counter. My heart was beating very fast, but my hands, when I looked at them, were perfectly still. Sandra filed the formal divorce petition on a Monday morning in April, 11 days after I confirmed Daniel's living situation. The petition was comprehensive. It listed all 3 properties with full documentation of my professional and financial contributions to each. It requested equitable distribution, weighted in my favor on the 2 income-generating properties, based on documented evidence of my primary role in their acquisition and management. It requested the family home remain under my occupancy while the children were minors, given that I was the primary residential parent. It requested child support, calculated on Daniel's business income I had records of because I had filed our joint taxes. Sandra told me she expected a response within 2 weeks. She was right, but the response was not what either of us predicted. On a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days after the filing, Daniel appeared at my front door unannounced. He had never done that before. He rang the doorbell like a visitor, which was almost funny and also profoundly strange. I opened the door and looked at him. He looked different. Thinner, maybe, or just stripped of the comfortable confidence he'd always carried. He was not alone. Behind him, slightly to his left, was a man I didn't recognize. Early 40s, expensive shoes, the particular stillness of someone who is paid to be in rooms and say little. His attorney, brought to my front door, without an appointment. "Claire," Daniel said, "we need to talk." "Your attorney can call Sandra," I said. "This is beyond attorneys," he said. His voice had gone hard. "Do you understand what you've done? You've frozen the commercial property. The dry cleaner is up for lease renewal next month. I can't sign anything. You've tied my hands." "Sandra's motion tied your hands," I said. "I didn't file it, she did. On my behalf, legally." The man behind him, I assumed his name was Walsh or Griffin or something equally suited to expensive shoes, said very quietly, "Mrs. Marsh, I would encourage you to consider the position you're putting yourself in. Judges don't look favorably on spouses who appear to be weaponizing marital assets." I looked at him. "I'm not weaponizing anything. I'm protecting a documented financial interest. If your client had concerns about the properties, he should have raised them before he walked out with a duffel bag." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think you're so smart," he said, and his voice had dropped into something uglier. "You think you've got all the cards. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I've known you for 22 years, Daniel," I said. "I think I know exactly who I'm dealing with." "Drop the filing on the commercial property," he said, "or I will make this divorce very expensive and very public for you." And there it was, the threat, naked and specific. I held the door open another moment. Then I said, "Have a good evening, gentlemen," and I closed it. I stood in the hallway with my back against the door, and I will tell you honestly, I was shaking. Not from fear, exactly. Or not only fear. It was the physical aftermath of holding yourself completely composed in front of people who want to break you. Your body has to process what your face refused to show. But the shaking stopped, and what replaced it was something harder, more durable. Over the following days, Daniel's attorney sent a series of letters to Sandra, formally worded, but with an unmistakable undertone of pressure. They questioned the legal basis of the protective filing. They implied I had acted unilaterally to sabotage marital assets. Sandra responded to each letter with the kind of precise, pleasant firmness that very good attorneys deploy like a scalpel. She told me, "He's making noise. Noise is what people make when they don't have a strong position." By the end of the second week after my filing, the threats had quieted. Not disappeared, quieted. Daniel's attorney stopped sending daily letters. The doorstep visit was never repeated. What replaced it was a tense, watchful stillness, the kind that meant they were regrouping. And I gave myself 3 days. 3 days where I didn't think about the divorce, the properties, or Daniel's face at my door. I drove to my sister's house in Cincinnati. My sister Rachel, who'd been divorced herself at 42 and understood things about survival that most people only know theoretically. I slept. I ate her cooking. I walked along the Ohio River in the evenings and let the cold April air take some of the weight off. On the third morning, I drove home. I was ready. The first temptation came on a Saturday morning in May, delivered not by Daniel, but by Kayla. I hadn't expected that. I suppose I had made the mistake of underestimating her. Not her intelligence, which I had no basis to assess, but her audacity. She texted me from a number I didn't recognize, though I knew immediately who it was. The message was long, carefully written, and opened with the words, "Hi, Claire. I know this is unexpected." She wrote that she wanted me to understand she wasn't a bad person, that she and Daniel had not planned for feelings to develop, that she respected my role as a mother and didn't want the children to be hurt. And then, with the seamless transition of someone who had rehearsed this, she suggested that if I agreed to an uncontested, simplified divorce settlement, she and Daniel were prepared to be very fair about the financial arrangement. She used the phrase, "move forward in peace," twice. I read the message once. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I went to make coffee. I want to describe the feeling accurately because it's important. It was not anger. Anger would have been easier, in a way, cleaner, more energetic. What I felt was something colder and more patient. The text was a piece of theater. It was designed to appeal to my desire for peace, my exhaustion, my maternal instinct to protect the children from conflict. It was, in other words, a manipulation, and not a particularly sophisticated one. I did not respond to the message that day, or the next, or at all. What I did instead was call Patrice, who had sent me the Instagram link weeks earlier. We had coffee at a place on High Street, and I told her, carefully, without dramatics, the full outline of what was happening. Patrice listened the way good people listen, without interrupting, without performing outrage, without making it about herself. When I finished, she said, "What do you need?" That question, that specific question. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to ask it. "I need to know I'm not crazy," I said. "You are the least crazy person I know," she said. "You're the most methodical person I know. That's different." I laughed. It was the first real laugh in weeks. Patrice became my social anchor through those weeks, but she wasn't the only one. My sister Rachel drove up from Cincinnati twice. My colleague Dennis, who had known me professionally for a decade and whose opinion I trusted, listened to me over lunch one afternoon and told me firmly that I was handling it correctly. "Don't let them rush you," he said. "They want you scared and hurried. Don't be either." I wasn't scared, or rather, I had decided that fear was no longer useful information for me. I had assessed the situation. I had made my decisions. The fear could exist as a background sensation, but it was not going to drive anything. And in the meantime, I watched. Daniel and Kayla, I was told through the inevitable grapevine of a mid-sized city, had begun to argue. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it without me asking. Apparently, Daniel had been seen at a bar downtown with the expression of a man who had made a large purchase and was beginning to notice the fine print. Kayla's Instagram, which I checked perhaps once a week out of what I told myself was professional vigilance, had gone quieter, fewer posts. The iced coffees had disappeared. I noted this without satisfaction, or rather, with a very contained, private kind of satisfaction that I kept strictly to myself. Sandra called me on a Thursday to update me. Daniel's side had requested a settlement conference, a formal mediated meeting in 6 weeks. They're looking for a way out that doesn't humiliate them, Sandra said. Can we give them one? I asked. We can give them a settlement, she said. Whether it humiliates them depends entirely on the terms. Tell me about the terms, I said. 2 weeks before the scheduled settlement conference, Daniel called and asked if he could come over to talk. Not about the divorce, he said. About the kids. I knew it was not about the kids, but I said yes, because refusing would have looked like fear, and because I wanted to see what version of himself he was planning to show me. He came on a Sunday afternoon when Chloe and Marcus were both at their respective activities. The house was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had called me used goods, the same table where he had once made pancakes for the kids on Saturday mornings. And he looked around the kitchen like a man visiting somewhere he used to live, which I supposed was accurate. He had brought coffee, 2 cups from the place on Fifth Avenue I'd always liked. A small, calculated gesture. I noticed the gesture, and I noticed the calculation behind it, and I accepted the coffee without comment and set it on the counter without drinking it. He started with the children. He was genuine there, I believe, or as genuine as a person in his position can be when every word is also a strategy. He said he was worried about Marcus, who had grown quieter since the separation. He said Chloe had called him less. He looked in that moment like a father who understood that he had broken something that couldn't be unbroken, and who was only now beginning to feel the full weight of that. I let him speak. I said the appropriate things. Yes, the kids were adjusting. Yes, I thought regular time with him was important. Yes, we could work on the schedule. And then, so naturally, so smoothly, you almost had to admire the technique, he shifted. He said he'd been thinking about the settlement, that he felt the current approach was adversarial, and that adversarial wasn't good for the children, that he felt we could handle things privately between the two of them without lawyers driving up conflict. He said Kayla had helped him see that a clean, simple split would be better for everyone. He said very gently that he hoped I knew he had never wanted to hurt me, that his feelings had simply changed, that these things happened, and that I deserved to move forward too. I listened to every word. I watched his hands on the table as he spoke. They were steady, practiced. He had rehearsed this. Maybe with Kayla, maybe alone in the car driving over, but he had thought through every sentence, every soft pivot, every appeal to my better nature. And knowing that, seeing the architecture of the performance even while it was being performed, didn't make it entirely without effect. That's the honest truth. There's something disorienting about watching someone you built a life with deploy intimacy as a tactic, something that makes the ground feel briefly unreliable underfoot. He was asking me to drop Sandra, to abandon the protective filings, to accept a simple split, which, translated plainly, meant splitting things evenly, without any waiting for my documented contributions, without any professional consideration of how the income properties had actually been built and maintained. He was packaging a terrible financial deal inside an appeal to maturity, forgiveness, and the well-being of our children. It was, I will admit, a better approach than the doorstep confrontation. It was softer. It targeted different vulnerabilities. It didn't work. When he finished, I looked at him for a moment across the table. Then I said calmly, I appreciate you coming to talk about the kids, about the visitation schedule. We can have the attorneys formalize something that works for everyone. That's easy. And the settlement, he said. The settlement will proceed through Sandra and your attorney, I said. That's not changing. His expression shifted. The softness went out of it. Not dramatically, not explosively, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. He looked at me with something I can only describe as frustrated recognition, the look of someone who has played a card and watched it be turned over and set aside. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I'm making it accurate," I said. He stood up. He said, quietly, but with an edge that made the hair on my arms rise. "You're going to regret this approach, Claire. You think you've built something airtight. You haven't. There are things I can bring up in court that won't be good for you." I held his gaze and said nothing for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the maple tree was full and still. I thought about all the mornings in this house, all the years of ordinary life that had happened in this room, and I thought, he is counting on that weight to slow me down. He is counting on sentiment to do what threats couldn't. "Have your attorney bring them to Sandra," I said. "That's the appropriate channel." He left. He didn't slam the door. He closed it with the deliberate control of a man who wanted to slam it and chose not to, which is almost worse. I sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes after he left, and yes, I felt afraid. The threat had been real enough. Vague threats always are, because vagueness is their power. What things? What would he claim? What story could he tell about me, about our years together, that I hadn't anticipated? But the fear did something unexpected. It sharpened me. It made me colder and more precise than I had been before he walked in. I picked up my phone and called Sandra. "He came in person," I said. "He suggested dropping you and settling privately." "Of course he did," she said. "What else?" "He implied he has something to use against me in court." "Let him try," she said without hesitation. "We'll be ready." I believed her. The settlement conference was held on a Thursday morning in June in a neutral conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Columbus office building. The room had a view of the river on one side and the flat geometry of the city on the other. I wore a charcoal blazer and my good leather flats. I had slept 7 hours. I had eaten breakfast, oatmeal with blueberries at my own kitchen table in my own house, and I had driven downtown with the radio off in silence, thinking about nothing in particular. That was how I knew I was ready. When the mind goes quiet before something difficult, it means the preparation is complete. Sandra and I arrived 5 minutes early. Daniel and his attorney, whose name turned out to be Gerald Roth, not Walsh or Griffin, arrived together, and Daniel had brought Kayla. I was surprised by this. Sandra was not. "Emotional support," she murmured to me. "Or a prop. Either way, it weakens his position." Kayla sat in a chair against the wall outside the main table. She was wearing something that managed to look both very young and very deliberate. A silk blouse in a pale color, her hair carefully arranged. She looked at me when I walked in and then looked away. I registered her presence and moved on. I had no anger for her in that room. Anger was not a tool I needed today. The mediator was a retired judge named Harmon, a composed man in his 60s who had done this for decades and was thoroughly unimpressible. We began with the family home. Daniel's side argued for a sale and equal split. Sandra presented the children's school records, their established community connections, the documented disruption that relocation would cause. She presented my income stability versus Daniel's, whose business, it turned out, had seen a 23% revenue decline in the past year, a fact his side had failed to adequately account for. Judge Harmon listened without expression and made notes. Then came the income properties. This was where Gerald Roth deployed Daniel's counterattack. He produced a set of documents. Bank records, he said, showing that Daniel had been the primary earner throughout the marriage and that my property management contributions had been informal and financially dependent on Daniel's capital. He argued that my protective filing had been a strategic move to deny my client access to his legitimate assets, and that the court should view it as an act of bad faith. He was calm. He was organized. He was, I realized, reasonably good. And then Sandra spoke. She had a binder, a single meticulous 8-section binder which she had prepared over 6 weeks with my documentation and her legal analysis. Section by section, she walked through it. The loan for the duplex, my name as primary guarantor on record, the tax filings, my professional income listed as the contributing source for the mortgage payments for 9 of the past 15 years. Emails, actual emails, printed from Daniel, deferring to me on every property decision. Whatever you think, Claire, you know this stuff better than me. The commercial property lease agreements, signed by me, renewed by me, filed by me, with Daniel's signature appearing only on the original purchase documents and nowhere since. Gerald Roth interjected twice. Sandra acknowledged both interruptions with patient precision and continued. Judge Harmon raised one hand slightly, a gesture so minimal it was almost invisible, and Gerald Roth stopped interjecting. I watched Daniel across the table as Sandra spoke. He was very still. Not the stillness of confidence, the stillness of a man who is listening to a structure he built be disassembled piece by piece and is calculating in real time how much of it is left standing. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. At one point, he glanced at Gerald Roth, and Gerald Roth looked back at him with the carefully neutral expression of an attorney who has just realized the terrain is different than he was told. But that wasn't the decisive moment. The decisive moment came when Judge Harmon asked Daniel directly, "Mr. Marsh, were you aware of the annual property tax filings on the commercial unit?" Daniel said, "Yes, generally." "Were you aware that for the past 4 years, those filings were made under a professional property management designation, registered solely in your wife's name?" A pause. I knew Claire handled the filings," he said. "Did you understand the designation?" Judge Harmon asked. Gerald Roth leaned toward his client. A whispered exchange. Then Gerald said, "My client may not have been fully aware of the specific registration details." Sandra said pleasantly, "We have the acknowledgement forms, signed by Mr. Marsh. On 3 occasions." She placed them on the table. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted much longer than it should have. Judge Harmon picked up the forms. He looked at them with the unhurried attention of a man who has seen every variety of human self-deception and has learned never to rush through the documentation. Gerald Roth was very still. Daniel was staring at the center of the table. Across the table, Daniel looked at the papers. Then he looked at me. and I saw it. The exact moment when a person understands that the story they have been telling themselves, the version where they are the aggrieved party, the story where I was the obstacle and he was the reasonable one, that story collapsed. You could watch it happen in real time in his face. The set of his jaw loosened. Something behind his eyes recalculated and found nothing useful to land on. He looked, for just a moment, like a man standing in a room he doesn't recognize. Had he really never understood what I did? Had he signed those acknowledgement forms the way he signed everything I put in front of him, without reading, without caring, trusting that I would handle it? Probably. Probably that was exactly what had happened. And now that trust, that comfortable, careless trust he had extended for 15 years, was the thing that had undone him completely. Kayla, against the wall, had her hands folded very tightly in her lap. Gerald Roth asked for a 15-minute recess. I went to the window and looked at the river. I was perfectly calm. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Daniel's side returned to the table, Gerald Roth had the specific, careful expression of an attorney who is managing expectations he cannot meet. Daniel sat beside him, looking at the middle distance. Kayla was no longer in the room. Gerald Roth said that his client was prepared to discuss a revised framework. Sandra let him speak. She was good at that, letting people finish, never interrupting, making them hear their own words in the silence she offered afterward. The revised framework was, predictably, a series of concessions dressed as compromises. Daniel would concede the duplex. He wanted to retain joint title on the commercial property with a buyout option for me, meaning he could eventually purchase my share. On the family home, he dropped the demand for a sale and agreed to my occupancy, though he wanted a formal review in 5 years. Sandra listened to all of it. Then she said, "Thank you, Gerald. Here's our position." She outlined it cleanly. The family home, mine, sole title, transferred to me in full as the primary residential parent for 2 minor children, with Daniel's name removed from the mortgage and deed. I would refinance in my name alone within 18 months, which was financially feasible given my income. In exchange, Daniel would receive credit toward the settlement for his share of the home's equity. The rental duplex, mine, full title, based on documented financial contribution and management record. Daniel would receive a one-time payment representing a negotiated percentage of the duplex assessed value, assessed, as it happened, using a professional appraisal I had prepared myself 18 months prior, before any of this began, which Sandra had obtained through discovery. Daniel's credit for the duplex was fair, but conservative. The commercial property, divided with a court-supervised sale within 12 months and proceeds split according to contribution ratios Sandra had calculated and documented. Given the evidence, those ratios favored me at approximately 65%. Child support, calculated on Daniel's business income for the past 3 years, averaged and set at the Ohio statutory guidelines for his income bracket. Non-negotiable. Gerald Roth said, "That's a significant ask." "It's a documented claim," Sandra said. There was a long silence. Judge Harmon reviewed his notes. He said he would see no difficulty in recommending this framework to the court should the parties fail to reach agreement. Daniel, who had been very still, looked up and said, "What about the threat? About the things I said I could bring up?" I looked at him. Sandra said, Gerald, is your client intending to introduce new evidence at this stage? Gerald Roth said something quietly to Daniel. Daniel said nothing more. The framework was agreed to that afternoon, not all at once. There were 3 more phone calls between the attorneys over the following week, 2 minor adjustments, one moment where Daniel's side pushed back on the child support calculation, and Sandra sent a 4-page response within 12 hours. But the core held. Every major point held. 6 weeks later, a judge signed the divorce decree. I stood in Sandra's office when she called me. I was looking out the window at the street below. Summer now, the city warm and ordinary, people walking past coffee shops and parked cars, with no idea that anything had just concluded. Sandra said, "It's done, Claire." I said thank you. I meant it with everything I had. I drove home along the highway in the late afternoon. The light was that particular gold that Ohio does in July, low and long and generous. I turned into my street. I pulled into the driveway of the house, my house now, only mine, and I sat for a moment in the parked car. The maple tree in the backyard had all its leaves, full and green and absolutely certain of itself. I went inside. The first year after the divorce was not easy. I want to be honest about that because easy would be a lie. And I didn't survive all of this by lying to myself. There were nights when the house felt enormous. Nights when Marcus had gone to his room and Chloe was at a friend's, and the quiet of the kitchen was a kind of ache I hadn't predicted and didn't know how to name. There were mornings when I thought about the 22 years and felt something I couldn't quite call grief and couldn't quite call regret. A shapeless thing that sat with me over coffee and then left when I picked up my phone to start the day. But here is what else there was. Freedom, in the particular form that comes when you stop orienting your days around another person's moods and needs. The house felt like mine, not just legally, but physically, the way air in a room changes when something heavy is removed from it. I repainted the living room a deep, warm terracotta that Daniel would never have agreed to. I signed Chloe and Marcus up for summer sessions they'd wanted for years. I took a long weekend in New England in October with Rachel, just the 2 of us. And I stood on a pier in Maine on a cold, bright morning and felt, very simply, happy. Professionally, things accelerated. Without the low-grade anxiety of a deteriorating marriage consuming my bandwidth, I found I had energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I took on 3 new commercial clients. I was asked to consult on a significant portfolio appraisal for a development firm that had come to Columbus from Atlanta. I hired a part-time assistant for the first time. My income in the second year post-divorce was 28% higher than my best previous year. Marcus, who'd been quiet and withdrawn in the months immediately after Daniel left, came back to himself slowly and then all at once the way teenagers often do, over a summer of soccer and friends and the particular resilience of young people who understand more than adults think they do. By the following spring, he was talking about college programs he was interested in. Chloe graduated high school with honors. She chose a university 4 hours away and called me every Sunday evening. My life, in other words, was good. Genuinely, quietly, sustainably good. And then there was Daniel. I didn't seek information about him. What reached me did so through the ordinary mechanics of a shared city and shared social circles, delivered by people who weren't trying to update me but did anyway. Daniel and Kayla lasted 14 months. 14 months. Barely enough time to furnish the short north apartment. And then Kayla left. The specifics were various and somewhat inevitable. She was 19 and then 20, and the man she had thought she was choosing turned out to be a 53-year-old with a failing business, significant legal expenses from a complex divorce, and the emotional texture of someone who had just discovered that his confident self-image had been financed for 15 years by a woman he'd dismissed. The HVAC business, without the financial stability our joint household had provided, and with Daniel's attention divided during the divorce proceedings, lost 2 major contracts. He had to lay off 4 employees. Patrice mentioned this in passing at coffee one afternoon, the way people mention things they know you already know. Kayla's Instagram came back to life eventually. She appeared in new photos without iced coffees now, something more deliberately adult, a studied maturity she was performing her way into. No mention of Daniel, no evidence of what those 14 months had cost her. She was 20 years old. She would be fine, probably. She had time, which is the one asset that cannot be negotiated or appraised. Daniel, the last I heard through the ordinary grapevine, was renting a 2-bedroom house in a suburb further east than we'd ever lived. He had structured a repayment arrangement around his portion of the commercial property sale. He was civil when he came to collect the kids, and I was civil in return because we had children and would have children until we were old. And civility was the correct, sustainable choice. He looked tired. I felt no satisfaction in this, or rather, I felt the specific, reserved satisfaction of a person who was right and knew it, and who had no need to display it. I was not used goods. I was the appraiser. I knew exactly what things were worth. If this story has taught me anything, it's this. Know your value before someone tries to assign it for you. I spent 15 years managing everything, the properties, the finances, the filings, and I almost let one cruel sentence convince me that I was worth less than the paper my name was written on. I wasn't. Neither are you. Document everything. Know your rights. Find people who respect your intelligence. And never ever let someone else's exit strategy become your emergency. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And thank you, truly, for listening all the way to the end.
Thank you for being